morning. I'm pleased to introduce our guest for today, who's the legal advisor for international humanitarian law dissemination at the American Red Cross National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. Eric is a native of Iowa, and so he's used to the weather over here. And I hope you'll join me in welcoming to this
Well, thank you very much, Professor Weisbrot and Professor Fry, for inviting me here to speak to you today. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview on international humanitarian law and discuss how it relates to a really important situation that has the attention of certainly the Red Cross, but also the international community, and that's the armed conflict in Syria. Before we begin, I just want to get a general feel of the makeup of everybody here. I understand there's a mix of both law students and undergraduate students. Is that right? If you're an undergraduate student, I want you to raise your hand. Okay, great. Excellent. And law students? Okay. And how about Humphrey Fellows? Are there any in there? All right, excellent. That's great. I know Minnesota is a huge hub for Humphrey Fellows to come. Just a couple months ago, the American Red Cross, our team, the IHL unit, hosted Mustafa Farag. Does anybody know who that is? See some heads. Maybe he was a judge from Egypt, so we were really pleased to have him. The Humphrey Fellow program is quite extraordinary, and I think the University of Minnesota is lucky to have such to support it as much as it does. So let's dive into the content a little bit. Understanding that probably most of you in here haven't had a background in humanitarian law, I'm going to just introduce it really briefly, give a kind of a history of its development, and then discuss the basic rules before jumping into how humanitarian law in particular applies to the situation in Syria and what the American Red Cross and the Red Cross globally is doing in this conflict. So humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, is a body of law that applies during times of armed conflict and only during times of armed conflict. It is aimed to protect vulnerable populations in conflict zones, and it limits the means and methods of warfare. So, for instance, weapons and tactics that can be used. And the ultimate purpose of humanitarian law is to protect those who are vulnerable and to minimize the suffering of civilians during conflict. Humanitarian law is a little bit different than human rights law, and it's often easy to confuse the two. Human rights law does apply at all times. It applies during times of peace. It applies during times of war. And it establishes rights for individuals, but also prohibitions and protections from government abuse or government overstretch. Humanitarian law, on the other hand, again, is very narrow. It will apply only during situations of intense conflict, internationally, or conflict within a country, such as a civil war. And there's a growing debate out there about the role of human rights in humanitarian law, but there's a general principle that states during times of armed conflict, humanitarian law trumps human rights law. So what does that mean? Well, it means that during armed conflict, if there is a rule, if there's an established regulation or prohibition in humanitarian law regarding what combatants can do on the battlefield, the treatment of detainees, the protection of civilians, that rule is going to trump human rights law because it is the special law, it's the more specific law. So there's we can talk about a little bit more the relationship between the two later, but just some context there. Now, humanitarian law has actually existed for a long time, for thousands of years, but it's only been within the last 150 years or so where we have started to see codified rules that apply universally and stretch globally. The first codified set of rules was actually developed here in the United States during the Civil War by Professor Francis Lieber back in 1863. The rules are commonly referred to as the Lieber Code and kind of set the precedent for rules that still exist today. Just a year later, in 1864, the first Geneva Convention was developed. So that was the first internationally codified set of rules and norms regulating what combatants can do, what governments can do during times of armed conflict. And the law has kind of developed into two different strands. Initially, you have what's called the Hague strand, which was developed by the Hague Conventions of 1899 and a subsequent treaty, which primarily regulated weapons and tactics on the battlefield. But later, as the world saw different types of conflicts, larger conflicts, particularly World War I and World War II, there was a development of norms focusing more specifically on protection of individuals. So less on restrictions, per se, of governments, of militaries, and more focused on affirmative obligations to protect those who are wounded on the battlefield, those who are detained, and certainly civilians who aren't taking a part in the hostilities during the conflict. Those two have kind of merged together, and today we have the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and there's actually 3 additional protocols. And certainly there are a lot of other specialized treaties. There are weapons treaties, such as the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions treaties. There's a treaty that bans blinding laser weapons. All of these have the purpose of kind of restricting what is lawful during armed conflict, with the purpose of humanizing conflict and preserving human dignity to those who are vulnerable. So as I mentioned, 4 Geneva Conventions. Each convention protects a different vulnerable population. The first is wounded and sick soldiers on the battlefield. The second convention extends those same protections to those who are shipwrecked at sea. The third Geneva Convention protects prisoners of war, and the fourth protects civilians. So combined, we have today a very robust set of international law regulating the conduct of combatants and fighters on the battlefield today. Notably, other than the UN Charter, which I wouldn't say is a treaty per se, the Geneva Conventions are the only universally adopted treaties in the world. Every nation has ratified them. So what are the basic rules of humanitarian law? Well, I've kind of stated a few, but the first is that attacks must be limited to military targets. And we'll kind of see how this has played out a little bit in Syria specifically. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited, so again, you can't target civilians, and you have to use means of warfare, means and methods of warfare, which kind of ensure accuracy and precision, minimize collateral damage. Civilians, the wounded, those who are detained, must always be treated humanely, treated with care, protected. Those who are wounded and also prisoners of war, there are responsibilities to give them medical assistance and provide them medical care on the battlefield. And military medical personnel, as well as civilian humanitarian aid people, are protected from attack during armed conflict. So let's talk about how this global body of law, these sets of norms apply to the situation in Syria. I'm sure everybody's kind of been following what's been happening. I'll give a brief background and talk a little bit more about what the Red Cross is doing. So protests began back in March of 2011, demanding government reforms. This was largely a result of other things that were happening in the region, the Arab Spring at this point. I think the government there was already revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere, so this was very much kind of a continuation of what was happening a few years ago. These protests were quickly suppressed by government and military intervention, and the situation at that point already started to spiral out of control. Small opposition groups became armed. They tried to resist the government wherever possible, but it wasn't for many months later that they became organized, and finally under the banner of the Syrian Free Army started to work more cooperatively together and fight in unison. Certainly, understanding today that there are a variety of different groups still on the battlefield. They can't all be kind of clumped into this nebulous rebels or resistance movement. There are a variety of different groups, but certainly the Syrian Free Army is probably the best known out there. In July of 2012, so notably over a year after the protests had initially sprung up, the International Committee of the Red Cross came out and stated that the situation in Syria did raise the level of an armed conflict. Now, this is actually really interesting because the International Committee of the Red Cross doesn't generally make public statements of this sort. As a neutral and independent organization, it takes pride as some of its fundamental principles to not take sides in the conflict. But seeing that there wasn't a whole lot of movement on the issue, that there was, general condemnation, but there was uncertainty about the situation, what was happening there, I think the International Committee realized that they had to, be a little bit more proactive in their stance, so that they can maximize their protective mandate. So they declare that a non-international conflict exists. So what does this mean in the context of the conflict, in the context of humanitarian law? Well, it means that humanitarian law certainly applies. So here's an instance where humanitarian law, because we have an armed conflict, it is applicable to that situation. Okay? Vulnerable populations are certainly be protected from attack. Civilians are going to be protected from indiscriminate attack, from detention. You have a common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which applies during these types of conflicts. I could get into a little bit more specifically what type of humanitarian law applies during different conflicts. There are different types, international, non-international. But needless to say, the Geneva mandates still call for the humane treatment and respect for individuals on the battlefield. It also means that those who are fighting could be prosecuted for war crimes. There's a debate going on now how that might happen, when that might happen, whether it happens at the international level, whether it happens at the domestic level. But I think there's kind of a consensus reached that nothing can be achieved until peace has been established. So that's kind of a prerequisite in that regard. Interestingly, though, despite the general protections for civilians during conflict, those who take up arms, including those who are resisting the government forces, do become lawful targets under humanitarian law. And humanitarian law, unlike human rights law, is a little bit more, it provides some allowances and during times of conflict. And what I mean by that is, despite the fact that there are general prohibitions on certain types of weapons, certain people you can target, it does allow for the lawful use of military force. So humanitarian law assumes that kind of armed conflict is an inevitable state of international relations, and within those situations tries to minimize suffering and collateral damage. But it does allow for the lawful use of lethal force by combatants. So we'll see how that kind of plays out in a little bit. Since the beginning of protests back in March of 2011, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates that over 120,000 individuals have been killed. These are civilians, these are rebels, but these are also individuals, these are also members of government forces. The UN confirms this. They say 100,000, but that number hasn't been revised for a number of months now. So surely, as the conflict has continued unabated, that number is higher. So I think the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimate is probably the most accurate one that's out there. And they've been following the conflict since the very beginning. It's probably one of the most preeminent watchdog groups following Syria right now. There are over 2 million refugees that have fled Syria, the surrounding countries of Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. This is placing great strain on these surrounding nations. And it's also slowly allowing the conflict to spill over into other nations. We've already seen armed confrontations between the Syrian government and the government of Turkey, including a couple incidents where a Syrian aircraft was downed by Turkish military forces, as well as some other shots over the border. Israel, too, has struck a number of targets within Syria. Just recently, I believe it was yesterday or earlier today, there was another strike by the Israeli government. But also disturbingly, that 2 million number doesn't show the whole picture. There's another 5 million individuals within Syria that are internally displaced. So these are people who are still within Syria, but have been forced to flee their homes due to the violence in the country. If you take these numbers combined, that's over a third of the total Syrian population that's been affected by the conflict so far and has been displaced. You see a lot in the news, reports of different violations of international law, and unfortunately they are quite numerous. The conflict has continued to become more severe, and I think both sides have really gone all out in order to defend themselves and their territory. I would note that both sides have committed violations of international law, but certainly I believe the overwhelming majority of those violations have been committed by the Syrian government. Some of those include indiscriminate killing. Certainly this occurs in the shelling of towns, the indiscriminate shelling of towns, and aerial bombardments of towns. Torture, which is spelled incorrectly up there. I apologize, I just noticed that now. Detainees have been tortured. Some have been publicly executed. These are allegations that apply to both sides, actually. Widespread allegations of rape as a weapon of war. Targeting aid workers. I'll give you kind of a really startling statistic later on about the losses suffered by the Red Crescent in particular. But some aid workers have been targeted directly, while others have kind of been caught in the fighting and been harmed from indiscriminate shelling and use of force. Use of heavy weapons in civilian areas. The Syrian government, although it hasn't ratified treaties prohibiting the use of anti-personnel landmines or cluster munitions, have used both during the conflict. There have even been reports that the Syrian government has placed anti-personnel landmines around population centers in order to prevent civilians from fleeing or to harm those that are fleeing, which is awfully disturbing. And then certainly most recently in the news is the use of chemical weapons by the government of Syria, which the most recent allegation of which occurred on August 21st of this year. A strike with sarin gas in the eastern district of Damascus resulted in allegedly approximately 1,000 deaths. I think the number is unconfirmed, but we know that hundreds were killed, many were injured, and that number could be significantly higher. There are other reports of attacks that happened prior to that, all the way stretching back to December of 2012 and January, February, March of 2013. But this most recent attack in August was the one that really kind of sounded the alarms. So what are we doing about it? Well, the international community in general has found it exceptionally difficult to get into Syria and to provide assistance. In fact, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is kind of the global element of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement that operates in times of armed conflict, as well as the local national society partner called the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, is really the only international humanitarian organization that has had a constant presence within Syria since the beginning of the conflict. They have stayed there the entire time. Today, it's actually the Syrian operation is the International Committee's largest operation. There are over 140 ICRC delegates working in cooperation with its national society partners and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. Between 2012 to the present, the Red Cross Red Crescent has provided food to over 3.5 million people, has provided water and sanitation services to over 35 million people, and has also provided basic household necessities such as blankets, candles, and other things for over 1 million people just within the last about 18 months. Now, during this time, I mentioned that aid workers have been targeted, some have been killed. 22 Syrian Arab Red Crescent staff and volunteers have been killed during the conflict. And this number is really startling. It's devastating. It's intolerable. These are individuals who are risking their own lives to provide assistance and protection to those who are on the battlefield. And again, some of them have been caught in the fighting and have been killed during the fighting. And we know this is a risky business, but others have been targeted directly as well. A number of other individuals have been detained. Most recently, 6 International Committee of the Red Cross workers and a Syrian Arab Red Crescent worker were kidnapped just a couple weeks ago by armed gunmen. And these are really disturbing trends, and it shouldn't stand. The ICRC, in addition to providing food, water, health care, also works with all parties to the conflict to ensure respect for the rule of law. So they are in very high-level discussions with the Syrian government as well as rebel forces on the ground to educate them about their obligations under humanitarian law and to urge the respect for the rule of law. This is a really interesting thing that the Red Cross, Red Crescent, they could sometimes get some criticism for. Why would they be talking to those who are committing atrocities, or in certain other circumstances, why would they be talking to militant groups, terrorist groups, if you will? But again, this goes back to the role of the ICRC in particular and the Red Cross movement as neutral, impartial humanitarian actors. It's because of their role, their ability to work with all sides, to garner trust and support from everybody involved, that there aren't more deaths, that the ICRC and their national society partners can operate within the country continuously, while others are unable to do so for security threats. They're not able to get visas into the country, a variety of other reasons. So the ICRC's role is really critical and has made a lot of difference, even though the conflict continues. They also work with the government to establish humanitarian pauses and create humanitarian corridors. So a humanitarian pause, for instance, is a break in the fighting so that humanitarian workers who go in, extract those who are wounded and sick, and provide them assistance. And humanitarian corridors, theoretically, are also kind of alleyways, paths into armed conflict zones that would not be subject to attack. They would be protected. There would be a free flow of workers in and out of the area. The ICRC hasn't had a lot of success establishing these, but it's an ongoing effort. Another challenge as well is the inability of the ICRC to access detainees. And this is one of the reasons why they work with all parties involved. The ICRC's mandate is to, among other things, to visit detainees and to confirm conditions of detention that they meet certain standards as specified under the Geneva Conventions. And they have had extremely restricted access to detainees on both sides. I think it's my understanding that they've only been able to access detainees twice during the entire stretch of the conflict. So that's something that they're actively working on, but is also another troubling issue that the international community has to deal with. Individuals who are under the control of enemy forces who may or may not be treated with the care and respect that's due to them under the Geneva Conventions. So what does the conflict look like going forward? Well, unfortunately, there's no end in sight at this point. The United Nations estimates that by the end of the year, that refugee number could actually jump to 3.5 million people, so almost double. And there's only a couple months left in the year. That's very troubling. The first round of peace talks were derailed You see in the news now that certain individuals are trying to restart negotiations again, but both sides have placed certain conditions on those talks, none of which will probably be fulfilled. From my standpoint, it's unlikely that if these talks even take place at all, that they will generate any sort of productive plan for establishing peace or any sort of pause. Interestingly, though, after the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime back in August, the international community, backed primarily by the United States and with the cooperation of Russia, I guess, mainly precipitated by U.S. threats of force, use of force in Syria, led to the establishment of an agreement to transfer control of Syria's chemical weapon arsenal and to neutral international organizations, and for the eventual destruction of those weapons. Currently, the Syrian government has complied with those mandates and obligations under the agreement that was negotiated in cooperation with Russia and the United States, and is even ahead of schedule by a couple of days in shutting down its production facilities. So it's kind of interesting to see where this goes, but also shows that if the international community were to give this more weight, to throw more political force behind efforts to stop the conflict, that something might actually happen. We have an agreement for the elimination of Syrian chemical weapons that has worked thus far. So I think it's a good example where if the international community were to take additional steps and continue to push from a variety of different parties, both certainly from the United States and others in Europe, but also from Syrian allies such as Russia and elsewhere, that we might be able to come to some sort of an agreement, a ceasefire, something else. I don't know what that would look like, but at least this kind of provides a glimmer of hope for the future. And also on Wednesday, the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a joint subcommittee hearing on mechanisms for accountability in Syria after the conflict ends. So now we have government officials who are interested all of a sudden in seeing what the next steps are going to be after the conflict ends. To establish accountability mechanisms. What that looks like, again, we don't know. It could be international, it could be regional, it could be domestic, but there is a growing conversation, even here within the United States, at high levels of government, to take more action, to look forward, to establish conditions for peace, and then, more importantly, take that and create accountability and establish justice for the victims who have lost their voice during this conflict. And who can't express the sufferings and the hardships that they've had to endure. So that, again, is another positive step. And we'll see how that continues to develop. Certainly it'll take some time, but it's a step in the right direction. So if you're interested in learning more and taking action, I would urge you to go to the websites of the International Committee of the Red Cross and also the International Federation of the Red Cross. They have a lot of information, ways that you can get involved, ways you can support. One easy way to do it, which those of you who have laptops and smartphones right now, you can support from your seats the International Federation's Thunderclap. Are you familiar with the Thunderclap? I just recently kind of learned about it. So so Thunderclap is an organization that supports calls to action for others. So you can show your support by tweeting or posting something on Facebook, and if the organization, the federation in this instance, they meet their goals for support, there will be a thunderclap. So there will be a united distribution of these messages of support on social media all at once. And what that does is once you have hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of people tweeting, posting on Facebook all at the same time, it really generates awareness and kind of sparks interest in a lot of people because it hits a wide audience and it's disseminated pretty far. So it's pretty neat. So you can go to just a thunderclap.it and find the International Federation's call for support and become a part of that. You can also follow the Humanitarian Law Unit at the American Red Cross on Twitter, @Rules of War. You can also follow our blog as well. You can get more information there. So I know that's a kind of a lot of information coming at you, all in a short session. I hope that provides kind of a little bit more information about what humanitarian law is, illuminates how it applies to Syria, gives you a little bit more information on the situation in Syria and what's going on. But I'm more than happy to answer questions about Syria or other issues that you might have, drones, anything, cyber warfare, I like it all. So why don't we start here?
I just have a question. I missed like a few minutes of the presentation, I'm sorry. But you were talking about the fact that the Red Cross is an independent entity. Mm-hmm. Do you mind telling us a little bit about how do they get the financial support locally?
Sure. So financial support, say for instance from the Red Cross is made up of different entities. So you have national societies, which there's one national society in every country. There's actually 187, about to be 189 of them. Then there's the International Committee of the Red Cross. So national societies are funded primarily by donors. Sometimes they are funded by governments, but in small amounts. The American Red Cross, for instance, is funded overwhelmingly by donors. Somewhere in the reaches of 95% of the American Red Cross's funding comes from donors, not from the government. The International Committee of the Red Cross is a private Swiss organization that receives funding from national societies and other places as well. They're the ones that primarily operate in times of armed conflict. And then there's the International Federation, which is another global aspect of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. It's composed of the national societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Operates primarily in times of like natural disasters. So they provide disaster relief, whereas the ICRC does conflict relief. And the Federation is funded by national societies. So, I hope that answers your question. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah. I had a question. I may have just missed this in your presentation, but you were saying that in July, about a year after the ICRC declared an international armed conflict.
Yep.
And what's the legal relevance of that? As opposed to the Security Council making that kind of. Can you just talk about that?
Absolutely. So the ICRC's declaration that the situation in Syria was an armed conflict, and thus humanitarian law applies, is not legally binding. If anything, it provides some guidance. I would argue it is authoritative guidance because the ICRC, even spelled out under the Geneva Conventions, has very specific responsibilities. It's the only international humanitarian organization specifically mentioned in the Geneva Conventions. It's often referred to as the guardian of Geneva Conventions. Given its work over the last 150 years, it is kind of seen as an authority in this regard. But in terms of legal binding weight, it doesn't have it. So, for instance, the alternative, as you mentioned, a UN Security Council resolution maybe, coming from nations themselves, that could have some legal binding significance and some weight. Calls to action or condemnations by high-level UN officials might have some legal weight. Ultimately, it's up to states themselves. It's a state's responsibility to kind of classify situations. The UN is a good vehicle to do that because it kind of shows conformity, not conformity, but kind of unanimous support, consensus for the status of the conflict. But again, it's really interesting that they came out and said something at all. They typically don't. The ICRC is a very confidential organization. It does not disclose communications that it has with actors on the ground, including the government. Anything that it finds that is concerning to them, they report up the chain of command. They don't testify in court, even in international courts. There's actually they have immunity from doing so. So that confidentiality is an important reason why they're able to gain access to a lot of different areas that other organizations wouldn't, because they're seen as neutral, seen as independent. But yeah, in terms of legal binding weight, the ICRC's declaration is more guidance than anything.
So why did they do it?
I think it was to draw more attention to the situation, to show that this has really raised beyond kind of sporadic acts of violence. It has become an organized conflict within Syria. There are clearly organized groups resisting the government. They have a leadership structure. Somehow it's a hierarchy. It's coordinated efforts, coordinated operations. And I think they wanted to increase awareness of the severity of the situation, but also be able to pursue their protective mandate and operate in the country with greater support and more freely to say, look, these are the rules of IHL. These are the protections that are given. These are the mandates that we have to act upon. And I think they wanted more support internationally to be able to do that. Of course, I'm not a representative of the ICRC, so I can't speak to their specific motivations, but if I had to guess, that would be my assertion. Other questions? Yeah.
You talked about the application of humanitarian versus human rights law in times of conflict.
Yeah.
And I think you said that the humanitarian rule will trump, but I was wondering, in the absence of a humanitarian rule, if human rights applies, then if it's something like right to education or something where theoretically if that applies, what practical use does it have in a situation of armed conflict?
It's a really good question. So, and I'll kind of put the caveat that there's a big debate going on right now about how these two bodies of law operate together. I'll note, without going into kind of what the law says about the issue, in these civil war type conflicts, these internal conflicts, the non-international armed conflicts, is the term of art legally, the written law that applies for the Geneva Conventions is very small. In fact, it's a single article in the Geneva Conventions called Common Article 3. I made reference to it earlier. It's 2 paragraphs long. It's the only codified set of rules that applies during armed conflict. Certainly there are things like customary norms. So there are practices that have become supported by nations at such a wide level that nations follow those out of sense of like a legal obligation to do so. And there are a lot of IHL rules that have risen to the status of customary law. But when IHL doesn't speak to an issue, human rights law is there to fill the gap. And that's how the two operate together. I would say in most circumstances, human rights law and humanitarian law, they say the same thing. They work in unison. They have similar purposes, protection, affirmative rights. But it's in those rare instances, for instance, the combatant's privilege, the privilege to kill without legal repercussions, as long as it's within the confines of IHL, that's a difference. Another one is the right to detain. So you can capture enemy combatants as prisoners of war during international armed conflict, or as detainees, if they're other fighters, they're militant fighters. There's even some circumstances where civilians can be interned during armed conflict. So detention and killing are 2 areas where there is a divergence between the laws, and there is conflict. But most times they support one another, they're complementary of one another. But if IHL doesn't speak to a rule, human rights law should be there to fill the gap. Other questions? Yeah.
From the perspective of international humanitarian law, what is the international community's, and that might be really broad, but what has the general response been to drone strikes? Because I know that you mentioned that, according to the Geneva Convention, indiscriminate acts are prohibited. And I know the intention of drone strikes is targeted, but it seems that in instances that's not necessarily the case.
Yep.
So what has the general response been?
There's a big debate going on. I think you have IHL experts. They have concerns, but I think they have a different view than human rights experts. And I guess I'll speak in my personal capacity answering this question. But the first thing you have to do is kind of separate out a couple different issues. The first is the drone platform itself. As a weapon, as a platform, it clearly falls within the permissible confines of humanitarian law. In fact, it's better than most weapons. As you mentioned, they're designed to be more precise. Drones offer a lot of advantages that other weapons don't. So drones can loiter for a long period of time, surveilling an area, gathering intelligence on the spot, and that allows commanders on the ground to have a greater awareness of what's happening on the ground, and with more information, be able to make an informed decision about whether a strike would be permissible or not. You also look at the weapons that they use. Hellfire missiles, which are precision weapons. They can hit any spot, within about a meter. They are extremely accurate, and it's much better than the alternative, say, like a mortar round or something, where you're kind of doing a bit of a scatter shot type of action. So if you look at it that way, the weapons and the platform definitely comply with IHL. But any lawful weapon could always be used in unlawful ways. So you have to look specifically at how it's being used. And there are some things which are definitely concerning. I think indiscriminate attacks, there's not enough data in my mind to be able to make an informed decision about that. You have human rights groups, even a couple of law schools have supported reports that show that there are a lot of civilian deaths. There are also a lot of militants that are killed too. I would like the U.S. government to release a little bit more information and substantiate their numbers, which say that, small amount of civilians, a lot of militants. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. But I'd like to see more evidence of, who's being targeted and who's being harmed ultimately. I think there are even more concerning things, so-called signature strikes that are striking at individuals based on characteristics that they possess. So they're kind of lifestyle patterns, being like living in a troubled area, like the tribal borderlands in Afghanistan and Pakistan. If you're an 18-year-old male, you're more likely to be targeted, stuff like that. Without information about who these individuals are, it's pretty clear that there are strikes against people because of certain characteristics that they possess. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. They could be bad guys. They might not be bad guys. I just don't know. There's also a concern, I think, with so-called drone strike double taps, which is an initial strike against suspected legitimate targets, but then a secondary strike on first responders. And I think the government's argument, and I'm not, again, speaking for the government, but I think their argument is that anybody who's going to help a bad guy is probably a bad guy themselves. But, that assertion doesn't necessarily make those strikes permissible in itself. I think there's got to be more intelligence gathered. Those individuals could be innocent civilians who are genuinely trying to assist those who've been wounded. The people in the initial strike, again, they might not even have been bad guys. We just don't know yet. There's got to be more information. So I think that's the issue. Drones in general, not a problem. How they're used definitely raises some issues. Other questions? I think we have 4 minutes left or so. Maybe time for a couple more questions. I'll talk about anything. I could talk about IHL video games.
Do you want to comment on the relationship between IHL and the responsibility to protect doctrine?
Yeah, sure, I could do that. So, is everybody kind of familiar with the idea of responsibility to protect?
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
Everybody's looked at it. Okay, that's good. So, I would argue that without trying to get too much into like the law, they're kind of separate questions. I would argue. So there's the jus ad bellum, jus ad bellum. Is everybody kind of familiar with that term? Jus ad bellum. Then there's the jus ad bellum. The jus ad bellum are legal questions concerned with reasons why nations or groups resort to force. Okay, so the kind of the questions before force is used, justification questions. Is there a right to use force, whether it be self-defense or otherwise? Is there just cause? Is there a right action? Those are jus ad bellum questions. Then there's the jus in bello, which is legal questions that apply during conflict. And IHL is only concerned with the latter, with the jus in bello. It's a law. It's again a specific law that applies during conflict itself. It doesn't really concern itself with questions of justifications for using force. So while I think things like war crimes, mass atrocities, other violations of international law can be evidence to support a justification for the use of force, IHL itself, the body of norms, doesn't really speak to the justification or the rightness or wrongness of using force. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of dense. That's really weak. So, yeah.
I just want to follow up. Is the purpose of that to help maintain its neutrality, and so it doesn't get into maybe more political issues of when?
I mean, I guess I'm not really sure how it relates necessarily to neutrality. I think again, it's designed to address concerns that have developed over the last couple hundreds of years that there weren't norms protecting people during the war. That war was just inevitable, and war is war. Things happen in war. That's just the nature of it. It's unregulated. So the response, the Geneva Conventions and the other treaties were a response to that kind of state of lawlessness, and said, look, even during these times of war, there is no absence of law. There are prohibitions on using certain weapons and tactics. There are affirmative obligations to protect civilians, assist those who are wounded, care for prisoners of war, etc. So it was more a response to kind of limitless battle than anything else.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.